I don't often go looking for memories in my kitchen, but a few days ago, in a group chat with old college roommates, someone mentioned a Southern casserole we used to eat at school in Lynchburg, Virginia. I hadn't tasted it since 1979, and I found myself wondering, had it become just one more thing quietly lost as the years moved on? It took me a while to track down the old recipe for John McGurney, but once I did, I headed to the grocery store excited as I picked up each ingredient one by one, and slowly it all started coming back. The smell, the taste, the memories made around something so simple. But then we graduated. Life changed, new responsibilities took over, and somewhere along the way, we forgot to carry certain things with us. I turned 69 last month, the final year of another decade, and lately I've been thinking a lot about change. Not all change feels dramatic when it happens. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just the slow realization that the things that once consumed you no longer do. And maybe that's what growth really is. The freedom to walk away, to finally say, I just don't care about that anymore. We've talked about protecting our peace. We've talked about emotionally detaching from the chaos around us. And today, that moment when you realize the biggest change wasn't in the people around you, it was you. So today, let's talk about that. We've talked over the last 2 weeks, now 3 weeks, about protecting your peace, emotionally detaching, and what that feels like. And today we're going to talk about realizing that maybe the biggest change is actually in you. And so how do we embrace that? You know, there's a strange moment that happens as we get older. For some of us, it seems to happen overnight. For others, it happens slowly, maybe over several years. But you start noticing that certain relationships feel different. It can be a relationship with elderly parents. It can be a relationship with a best friend. It can be a relationship with a grown child or a neighbor. And maybe there wasn't a dramatic event. You know, we've talked about the changes, the big changes when you leave the workforce, you leave your volunteer work. Maybe you move away, you leave a sport that you used to be competitive in. Maybe you fall ill or injure yourself. Maybe you found things that you enjoy now or more solitary hobbies, painting, gardening, hiking, doing puzzles, bird watching. You know, maybe your time isn't your own, because there are a lot of folks here on the channel who are caring for elderly parents. Others are babysitting grandchildren to help their grown children out. Maybe your spouse is unwell. Maybe someone's been injured. There's so many unpredictable issues because we don't all age on the same timeline. And facing the fact that you no longer can participate at the level or the way you used to can be pretty emotional. And at first we think, well, it's the people around us that are changing. It's not us. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're cutting back and pulling back. And we may genuinely believe that something happened to them. We're the same. We didn't change. Why are they so controlling now? Why are they so dismissive? Why do they seem more draining than ever? Well, we're looking at it our way. And eventually, most of us come to the place where we realize that they were always the way they are. It was us that was different. We were more willing to tolerate things we just don't feel like tolerating anymore. And it comes down to the changes that we're going through, and each of us is different. And that's tough to deal with, especially at our age, because we've been doing things the same way in many cases for so long. Maybe you were raised to smooth things over. We talk about that all the time here, especially the older children. Maybe you kept the peace. Maybe you were the understanding one, the always available one. You were taught to be accommodating. And we had the time and we had the energy. And honestly, when we were younger, we had the emotional bandwidth to keep up with a million different things at one time. You know, what do we do when that late life shift happens? And how do we know something's happening? Well, sure, we get tired, physically tired, but also tired in our soul. Tired of over-explaining, tired of managing other people's emotions, tired of walking into rooms ready to brace yourself for what's about to happen, tired of having too much to do, too many places to go, too many things to prepare. So one day you simply stop. Nothing dramatic. Just quietly, kind of like a balloon slowly losing air. You realize that you've stopped chasing, stopped fixing. You're not interested in volunteering for anything, and especially not things that people no longer appreciate. And then you start to imagine that people are treating you differently, and sometimes they are. Why? Because you've changed. You've changed your role, the role that they expected. And they weren't prepared, and maybe you weren't prepared. You're just no longer doing things that you don't have time to do. But remember, they think you always had time to do everything. So sometimes the relationships in your life were functioning because you were carrying extra baggage, extra emotional weight. You were the peacekeeper, the listener, the forgiver. You found yourself always having to be the flexible one. And we talked about that in our earlier videos, because sometimes there are just uncontrollable forces that come into your life and force you to do things differently. And that can be happening to your friend too, or a family member. We're not all in control of our destiny at this stage of life, but when we stop trying to keep up with our younger self, the imbalance becomes visible. We feel it, we see it. And those closest to us are obviously going to see that something's changed. Maybe we're not showing up as much as we used to. Maybe we're having to cancel from time to time or just say no. And then what happens? Well, they stop inviting us. They stop including us. They don't worry about us anymore. And yes, a few people may check in, but I think most of us have found that when life goes on for others, it goes on, and often we're not included. And I think it can feel incredibly confusing at first, because you're almost grieving. You're grieving the old you, and you're grieving the old relationships that have had to change. We're grieving that old version of ourselves. Some of it was mental, but a lot of it was physical. And at least for me, and I bet for you, that version was a version that worked really hard. Hard to do the right thing, worked hard, so they were chosen, so we were chosen. Worked hard to avoid conflict. And maybe for years, you believed that, if I'm a kind, patient friend, understanding, that this will come back to me as I get older. These friendships will keep pouring into me because I've made these investments in people over the long haul, and they're going to last the test of time. But sometimes we realize they never will, and they never were going to, because they were not mutual. Sometimes we were so busy over functioning that we found ourselves in a one-sided dynamic, one-sided friendship. We didn't mean to, it just happened. And it hurts when we finally say, uh-oh, maybe this was me, but it's also freeing. And one thing that I hear from a lot of you, and women and men in general over 50, is they say, wow, I can finally see people so clearly now. Now. Isn't that a powerful word? Just one word. Now I see it. That is happening not because we became cynical, but because we became more experience. We removed delusions. We're wiser. We started recognizing patterns faster, those red flags. You're acutely aware of who only calls when they need something, who becomes a little uncomfortable or pushes back when you say no or you set a boundary. Some of these people supported the old version of you, but they're going to resist this healthier version of you because you are making the change. And so, with all honesty, that is going to feel lonely because there's going to be a gap, right? When you grow, there's a gap. And who you're compatible with will change. And not everyone gets to come along with you into this peaceful new time in your life. Or maybe they come along but don't spend as much time in the same lane with you. We don't have to connect anymore through stress or rescuing or emotional dependency. We've been there, we've done that. When those things start to disappear from how we define friendship, the relationships that weren't strong, that were dependent on those weird things, will start to weaken too. And we talked about it last week. You're not heartless when you realize you have to change. Emotionally detaching doesn't mean you stop caring. Protecting your peace doesn't mean that you're becoming selfish. And changing doesn't mean you've become cold. And I feel like I say that so much, but we've really got to drill it into our very stubborn minds. Because I think that women in particular, yes, men too, but we're just, we carry a lot of guilt. We learned it when we were little. And when we start setting healthier emotional limits or boundaries, especially when you've spent decades being that dependable one, the minute you stop being overly dependable, overly giving, some people will act like you've done something wrong. You've changed for the worse, but maybe in all actuality, we're just becoming more balanced. And quite honestly, it's a very healthy balance. I think there's really a quiet power that comes from no longer needing approval, not depending on it. One of the biggest emotional shifts that I think happens at our age is we slowly but surely stop needing others in our circle to understand us. I was having lunch with some old colleagues last week, and we were talking about some drama that was happening currently. And my one friend said, "My gosh, I'm so happy I don't care about that anymore. I only give my energy now to things that make me happy, things that I'm invested in." And everyone at the table just kind of sat back and took a breath. It's freedom. Because when we were younger, many of us, and especially this group that I worked with, were constantly trying to keep up and do more and spread our boundaries to accept more and more and more. And now we're realizing that healthy people don't require an almost courtroom-like presentation for every decision they make. It's okay to sit back and just breathe. You can simply say to yourself, you know, that doesn't work for me anymore, and just leave it there. What do they say? No is a sentence. No long defense, no emotional essay, no guilt spiral. But what if? That kind of peace is really earned, and it's earned by our age. And there's one other reality that for some people is a little tough. Sometimes a healthier you becomes inconvenient for some of the people in your life. Saying no doesn't work. When you stop playing in the card group, you just can't take it anymore. When you start to worship someplace new, when you start to volunteer somewhere else, that can be seen as disrupting. And disrupting for many people is a problem. But honestly, it's you finally realizing that your peace is more valuable than their approval. And there's nothing to be gained anymore. No big bonus, no big promotion, no getting selected, the head of the group. Maybe we've all learned that being needed is not the same thing as being valued. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. Because when you stop pouring all of your energy into a draining dynamics, what's the payoff? Now, at this stage of life, we finally have energy for ourselves and energy to pour into friendships and relationships that matter. We should be laughing more naturally, resting differently. Take that nap. Feeling lighter, safer in our own home. You stop rehearsing conversations, explanations in your head. You take that breath of freedom. And maybe we, in some ways, are connecting to that person who we really are. Something to think about. Not the person that you built over the years just trying to survive and trying to keep the peace, but maybe more honest you, someone who's a little more in touch with what really matters to you. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts of getting older. We become less performative, less desperate, that may be a strong word, to be chosen, but less willing to betray ourselves just to keep a relationship intact. If you've been feeling this shift lately, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If all of a sudden certain relationships feel heavier, if your tolerance has changed, if your silence has become more intentional, that pause, that time you take for yourself. I think if you're going through this, or you think you're going through it, you're not imagining things, right? Something has definitely changed. And chalk it up to wisdom, chalk it up to energy, chalk it up to ability. But once you see it, it's impossible to turn back the clock. Well, I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.